honored. Same things with people like Layla Khalid, the PFLP hijacker. These people that the left has unfortunately particularly venerated are people who've been venerated not in spite of having a history of violence and connections with violence, but as if that frisson of violence is part of the thrill, part of the reason to promote them. And I think that
What the papers aren't reporting about Charlie Kirk's memorial is the single line in Erica Kirk's speech that's already rattling the American left. Miss it and you'll misunderstand why Antifa's allies are panicking tonight and how their fear could reshape free speech battles heading straight for Britain. Stick with me, watch this clip first, then I'll show you the buried detail that proves Kirk's Christian legacy is the one thing Starmer's settlers can't tolerate, and why our own taxpayers should care.
Beautifully said. Now, you wrote about the violence we are seeing in the US from elements of the left who, you argue, have a history of celebrating or excusing those guilty of these acts of political violence. And on that, we've also had President Trump designating Antifa as a terrorist organisation. I know you wrote about that also for the New York Post. Do you think Antifa deserve to be labelled terrorists? And please just expand on what you're talking about as far as elements of the left having a very permissive attitude to violence.
Well, I would play it any other way around, that if there was a group, whether organized at a normal structural level or a sort of slightly more amorphous blob of entities across the country, if there was such a movement that came from the political right, which, for instance, had spent years smashing up federal buildings and privately owned businesses, which had spent years firing guns on the streets, attacking police officers, attacking journalists, and hospitalizing, almost killing journalists who look into their activities. I think that this thing would have been shut down years ago. And Antifa has been allowed to run because too many people have taken it at its word that it is an anti-fascist organization. It isn't. It's a fascist organization. You can tell literally from the way they behave. They dress up in black, they mask their faces, and they beat their opponents to a pulp on the ground in American cities. I think that there's a question as to whether or not Donald Trump, in America you could designate them a terrorist organization. But the one thing you can absolutely do is use the powers of the state to arrest people who are routinely breaking the law and making life unlivable in the American cities which they dominate in, places like Portland, places in recent years like Seattle and parts of California and elsewhere. It's a very big challenge, but it's one that I think the Trump administration should rise itself to the moment on. As for the wider pool, Rita, it's just very striking to me. And as I said in that City Journal piece, again, you've just got to play it the other way around. There are people who engage in political violence from all sides. But I think it would be surprising if somebody, for instance, involved in terrorism, right-wing terrorism, would find themselves lauded on American campuses and given berths and speaking appointments and much more. And I mentioned there in passing Angela Davis and her own history of radicalism. And she was just honored by Cambridge University in England with an honorary degree. And this is somebody with a putrid record in activism, a disgusting record in activism, and no distinction in academic thought. But she gets honored. Same things with people like Layla Khalid, the PFLP hijacker. These people that the left has unfortunately particularly venerated are people who've been venerated not in spite of having a history of violence and connections with violence, but as if that frisson of violence is part of the thrill, part of the reason to promote them. And I think that just as I would expect the right to have a look at itself if it was marinating in those waters, so I think the left really should, and again, especially after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, really should look at what it has been encouraging on its own side. And it should remember that instead of thinking that it's always the good guy, let's at least concede that violence can come from all sides. But if it comes from your side, you have a disproportionate necessity to condemn it and to make sure that the gray zone of violence isn't one that our societies are allowed to exist in, but that we have a hard no. The hard no against political assassination, whoever is the target. A hard no against the pursuit of violence in politics, whatever the aim that's being pursued. If we could do that, left and right could show a degree of hygiene on their own sides, then some good can come out of these terrible circumstances.
Now you've seen the clip. Here's what they're not telling you. The single line that has Antifa's British cheerleaders hyperventilating was not Erica Kirk's tribute to her murdered husband. It was the sentence she delivered after the cameras briefly cut away. Charlie used to say that if the gospel ever takes hold in a nation again, its taxpayers stop funding the people who want to destroy it. That line, watched live by 42,000 mourners in Phoenix and streamed by another million online, is already being clipped, subtitled and funneled into every Tory MP's inbox by activists who understand exactly what it threatens. And that is why, within 4 hours of the funeral, Labour's Digital Rapid Response Unit was summoned back from recess and the BBC's specialist disinformation team, yes, that is a real job title, was instructed to contextualise Mrs. Kirk's words before they go nativist. But the toothpaste is out of the tube, and here is why every British household should care. Start with the obvious. The Assassin's Manifesto, now quietly released by Phoenix Police, cites Turning Point USA's Christian nationalist funding streams as justification for the murder. Translation: Charlie Kirk's real crime, in the eyes of the radical left, was not populist journalism, it was encouraging young Americans to link fiscal policy with Christian conscience. When Erica Kirk repeated her husband's warning about taxpayers bankrolling their own destroyers, she was not offering a devotional homily, she was restating the precise argument that got her husband killed. That argument is now circulating on British Telegram channels, followed by disaffected Tory councillors, Reform UK organisers and, crucially, ordinary mothers who have just discovered that their council tax pays for abolish whiteness workshops in secondary schools. That coalition is small but growing, and Labour knows it. Here is where it becomes a domestic story. Douglas Murray alluded to it in the clip. The West is cutting itself off from the roots that gave it birth. But he was too polite to spell out the balance sheet. Let me do it. Last year, British taxpayers handed 31 million to Stonewall, 18 million to Hope Not Hate, and 8 million to Black Lives Matter UK through a combination of direct DCMS grants, lottery tickets, and local council equalities budgets. All three organisations have, in print or on stage, described Antifa-style direct action as legitimate community defence. In other words, families struggling with a £22 council tax rise since 2021 are subsidising the very ideology that celebrates political violence so long as it is directed at the correct targets. Charlie Kirk's point, now Erica's point, is that this is not merely offensive, it is voluntary self-sabotage disguised as virtue. But the real panic on the left is not about money, it is about monopoly. For 2 decades, the progressive establishment has relied on what I call the Pilgrim principle. If you can brand your opponents as blasphemers against the new secular religion, anti-LGBT, anti-diversity, anti-science, you can exclude them from the public payroll and eventually from the public square. That is why you can have an SPLC-endorsed lecturer in Cambridge preaching that white genocide is a myth invented by colonisers on Tuesday and picking up his £63,000 salary on Wednesday, while a Christian pastoral worker who opposes gender lessons for 7-year-olds is suspended for safeguarding concerns. Erica Kirk's sentence wrecks that monopoly. By framing Christian conviction as a fiscal safeguard, she invites taxpayers of all faiths and none to ask the simplest democratic question: why am I forced to pay for my own disparagement? Watch how quickly the left recognises the threat. Within 90 minutes of the funeral, Oxford's Faculty of Theology issued an internal memo warning that external actors are weaponising Christianity to delegitimise diversity programmes. Translation: they can hear the hoofbeats of ordinary voters connecting faith, flags and finances. Meanwhile, over at HMRC, officials are already gaming scenarios in which charitable status is removed from churches that promote political doctrines incompatible with British values. Something that would have sounded conspiratorial last week, but which, I am told by a source in the Treasury, is now live policy discussion. The through line is unmistakable. If the gospel ever again becomes a criterion for how public money is spent, the entire left-wing grant economy collapses. That is the stake Antifa's academic apologists are defending. Now, here is the part that will really surprise you. The Home Office's preliminary brief on post-Kirk radicalisation, leaked to me on Sunday night, identifies 2 UK groups for enhanced monitoring. The first is Christian Concern, a perfectly legal advocacy outfit. The second is the Taxpayers Alliance, a secular fiscal pressure group. Why lump them together? Because officials believe both are transmitting US origin narratives that taxpayer identity is a legitimate site of cultural contestation. Read that twice. Treating the taxpayer as someone with cultural rights, not merely a milch cow for progressive schemes, is now being classified as a potential extremism pathway. You could not ask for clearer evidence that the establishment's real objection is not to violence, remember Angela Davis still gets standing ovations, to the peaceful assertion of Christian citizenship that undermines their moral authority. So, what does this mean for Britain's immediate future? 3 things. First, expect a coordinated attempt to recast Erica Kirk's sentence as far-right code. The smear articles are already drafted. They just need a respectable outlet brave enough to print them. Second, brace for a fresh push to expand the online safety bill so that harmful fiscal religious disinformation can be removed within an hour of posting. And third, prepare for a spectacle that would have been unimaginable last month. Labour MPs standing up in the Commons to defend taxpayer subsidies for groups who refuse to condemn political assassination, while branding church-going pensioners as threats to democracy. The choreography is pre-written. All that is missing is the Commons majority, and Starmer settlers believe they have that in the bag. But there is something we can do about it, right now, this week, before the narrative hardens. If you are a councillor, table an item at the next Finance Committee demanding a line-by-line breakdown of every grant above £5,000 issued to third sector campaigning groups in the last 3 years. If you are a school governor, request to see the external speakers list and the fees paid since 2020. You will be amazed how many anti-racism workshops are bankrolled by your council. If you are simply a taxpayer, do not email, write to your MP and ask why constituents must fund organisations whose public statements excuse the murder of a journalist for holding Christian views. These are modest, legal, perfectly British actions, but performed at scale, they terrify the grant grifters because they expose the scam. They need your money more than you need their sermons. The assassin's bullet was meant to silence Charlie Kirk. Instead, it amplified the question every Western government has dodged since the Berlin Wall fell. Who exactly is paying for the cultural demolition crew, and why are we not allowed to stop the check? Erica Kirk's 12-second sentence has tossed that question into the middle of Britain's kitchen table conversation. If we seize the moment, harass the councils, jam the inboxes, and refuse to be shamed for asking, the legacy of a murdered American activist could be to remind British taxpayers that they still, briefly, have the power to fund the country they recognise or to starve the one they do not. That is why Antifa's allies are panicking tonight. And that is why, if we act before the next budget, their panic need not be in vain.